Hello and welcome back to Layman's Perspective, the show where I wish Evan Peters was my uncle too. This is obviously a spoiler review, so absolutely do not watch anything here until you've seen episode 6, then come back and see what I have to say. Also, if you think I'm doing a good job and you're having as much fun watching these videos as I do making them, consider dropping a like, sharing this video, and subscribing to my rinky-dink little channel. It's always appreciated. Okay, let's jump right in. The first interesting tidbit we get during this episode is actually during the episode 5 recap. When they review the scene where Monica mentions Ultron, we see clips of Pietro's death, and this is the first time that we've actually seen visual references from other Marvel properties within the WandaVision show. Seemingly taking place during the early 2000s, the opening for this episode is a crystal clear homage to Malcolm in the Middle. I got this one immediately as soon as I started seeing it. While these opening titles flash, I'd like to note that what we see here is while every other character has a first and last name, Agnes is the only character, and I do say that in quotes, who has no last name, just a first name. This brings about a similar kind of suspicion, in my mind at least, to the fact that we never saw her on Jimmy's board of missing people back in episode 4, I believe it was? Yes. As the episode starts, Billy and Tommy talk to the camera in a very similar manner to the way that Frankie Muniz does in Malcolm in the Middle. Getting ready for Halloween, we see our first Easter egg of the week, with Billy's costume being a nod to his adult comic book superhero costume as Wiccan. Within a few minutes of this, WandaVision, Pietro, and Tommy also all don their vintage comic costumes as Halloween costumes. The twins approach a sleeping Pietro, and Tommy remarks he even snores cool. This being the first of many instances we see where the mini speedster seems to admire and look up to his uncle, who shares his powers. In fact, when Wanda walks down the stairs, you can even tell that while he initially liked her costume, he quickly corrects himself to agree with Pietro, saying that it was lame. Some of the dialogue here is, in fact, curious. First, when attempting to remind Wanda of a childhood memory of theirs, Wanda responds with, "That's not how I remember it," followed by Billy immediately telling us that she's been acting weird since Pietro came back. She also later laments to Vision with interesting emotional inflection that he is, quote, "full of surprises." This to me says that Wanda is very, very confused by not only Pietro's appearance and presence in general, but also aspects of his personality that are much different to the brother that she remembers. His behavior over the course of the entire episode is indeed bizarre. Specifically note here that when the camera goes back to Billy, Tommy acts as if Billy isn't speaking, while Pietro shoots him an interesting look in the background. Additionally, Vision comments that Pietro is surprisingly good with kids, a good observation seeing as how he has taken a shining to them for most of the episode. If we believe that someone or something is trying to get to / manipulate the children, as I speculated last episode, is this observation just a coincidence? Anyways, Vision and Wanda bicker over Vision's shift with the neighborhood watch, which could cause him to miss the twins' first Halloween. Dialogue in this scene, and a bit earlier when he rolls his eyes about his costume, to me read as Vision being rather passive-aggressive to Wanda about her attempts to control him after the arguments that they had in the previous episode. Pietro comes to cut the tension, offering to take the kids trick-or-treating, and it was here that I noticed that in this scene, Evan Peters doesn't really look like his character in the Fox X-Men movies. Instead of his perfectly straight, slick silver hair, the kind of ratty, wavy blonde hair that he has in the duration of this episode looks a lot more like Aaron Taylor Johnson's Quicksilver. From the back, I'd say it was honestly hard to tell the difference between the two actors. He also doesn't move quite the same way as his X-Men counterpart. Instead of simply zipping around with no effects, he trails blue energy behind him, again, like the MCU's version. Back outside the Hex, to sum up a very tense conversation, basically, Hayward is a huge dick, throwing Monica's absence from her mother's death in her face, while Monica's a badass, throwing right back at him that he's a coward for trying to use the last 5 years as an excuse to act the way that he's been acting. Back inside the Hex, I want you to really think about what Pietro says here to the twins. When they're walking around and they run to go trick-or-treating, he yells after them, "Unleash hell, demon spawn." Now, this could just be Pietro being a cool and cheeky uncle, but considering that more or less that's exactly what the twins are being used for in the House of M storyline, I have to think that that line is important considering what we might think is going on here. With a slightly suspicious look on her face, Wanda attempts to test Pietro with a memory from their childhood. Pietro immediately sees through this, just like we do, and calls her out on it. This is the first of many, many examples of Pietro, for some reason or another, being very situationally aware of what's going on, to a surprising and almost sinister degree. When she asks why he looks different, his response is also fascinating. If I had found Shangri-La, I wouldn't want to be reminded of the past either. The context of this sentence suggests that Wanda did in fact summon Pietro here, even though she behaves as if she did not. It also suggests that his appearance was effectively altered so as not to set her off, remembering what happened to her brother the first time. He zips away, interestingly being able to share his speed powers with both of the twins simply by touching them. And while they cause chaos in the background, Wanda is told by Herb that Vision actually had no shift with the Neighborhood Watch today, and we see instead that he's probing into Westview by himself. From his perspective, we can see that the people of Westview, the further and further away they seem to be from Wanda's influence, lose the realism and nuance of their, quote, performances, almost as if they're on standby until they're needed. Jimmy says so as much later in the episode. This reminds me of Herb, for lack of a better word, malfunctioning back in episode 3 when he was cutting into the wall between his and Vision's houses. More specifically, however, this scene with the woman crying on repeat in her front yard was just horrible. Especially since the hokey sitcom backtrack of the show doesn't stop as we focus in on her crying. Increasingly more and more, I find myself unprepared for just how dark and unsettling the show is turning out to be. As if to emphasize my point, we next get what I consider to be the most disturbing ad spot we've seen thus far. I mean, just look how disturbing this is! This is nightmare fuel! Each of the commercials seems to be a tie-in to Wanda's past traumas, with events like the Stark missile, Strucker, and Hydra all being referenced in different ways. While I'm unsure exactly how, my guess with this one would be that it's referencing the torture and experimentation that we know that both the twins went through at Strucker's hands, although I'm not that sure about this one. We're going to have to wait and see. Back with Wanda, we see more of Pietro's confusingly sharp level of situational awareness, saying things like, "I'm just here to play my part," and "where's your accent?" when she asks him about where his is. Before they can discuss more, the twins interject, and we see that Tommy's speed powers have manifested, much to the joy of both of them. They go to speed off, but not before Wanda warns them not to go past Ellis Avenue, a road which we later see seems to serve as the border for Westview inside the Hex. Outside in the base, Darcy hacks into the Sword Network, and the three of them uncover that Hayward has had a secret method to monitor the status of Vision inside the Hex, with a program presumably tracking his position based on the decay signature of the vibranium within his body. Monica literally beat me to the punch as I was watching this, asking why he's tracking Vision. And based on everything we've seen so far, Sword having possession of Vision's parts, Hayward observing his later emergence from the Hex with indifference instead of helping them, I'm not so sure anymore that Sword is benevolent. At the very least, I think it's safe to say that Hayward is definitively not. We see more evidence of the Wanda standby theory, with Vision so far away from the town center now that the people aren't moving at all. They're just frozen in place. He drops his disguise and floats over to a car stopped at a stop sign. We see that it's Agnes's car, and he resets her when he sees that she's just talking gibberish. When she comes to and asks him for help, while he knows who he is, we see that he doesn't know what an Avenger is. I don't think it's safe to declare prediction confirmed just yet, but this does seem more evidence to me that this is a Baby Groot scenario, where this Vision is a different character than one we've met previously. However, what threw me for more of a loop here was Agnes's behavior. She seems just as distressed, upset, and confused as any of the other influenced people we've seen so far, even though we've previously theorized her to be a malignant character influencing Wanda. The directors are really playing with us here, having Agnes deliver dialogue like "Wanda never lets us leave," while simultaneously having the character that many previously assumed to be a witch, dressed as a witch, with the evil cackle to boot. I still think she has something to do with everything. There's far too much evidence stacked in favor of this assumption to suggest otherwise. But this scene definitely threw a wrench into my speculation. If anything, I think they're trying to throw us off the scent, but I wouldn't write Agnes off just yet. Seemingly just as defeated as the audience by this sequence of events, Vision reboots Agnes and proceeds to venture beyond the aforementioned Ellis Avenue. Back at the base, Darcy warns Monica that she shouldn't go back into the Hex, telling her that the energy within it has already rewritten her cells at a molecular level twice. This, combined with the blank x-ray of her body we saw in the previous episode, makes me wonder if this is some foreshadowing to the character's future. In the comics, Monica not only temporarily dons the mantle of Captain Marvel, but later becomes her own hero by the name of Photon. I now have to wonder if this is Kevin Feige's way of planning to give Monica these powers in the near future of the MCU. Back with Wanda, we have our next instance of Pietro knowing much, much more than he should, when he asks Wanda where she's been hiding all of the kids up until this point, specifically saying, "Where'd you get all these kids from?" What's interesting here is that this technically points to the fact that somehow Pietro has an understanding of the previous episodes of the show not containing any children, which is something that we know, but it isn't something that he should know. He next says, "You've handled the ethical considerations of this situation as best you could. You kept their base personalities, you kept husbands and wives together, you even gave them better jobs." To which Wanda replies, "You don't think it's wrong?" And the context of that statement implies that, with no doubt, Wanda is definitely and consciously doing what's been going on in the Hex, and I no longer think that I can disagree with that statement. At this point, all I can hope for is a reveal later on that someone is somehow influencing her conscious decisions. But between this dialogue and her later expansion of the Hex, I really can't ignore the writing on the wall. Pietro's response, however, is what really got me. I'm not upset, I'm impressed. Based on this, I'm going to adjust a previous prediction of mine. I believe evidence is dwindling that someone did this to Wanda outright. However, the way Pietro phrases this now makes me wonder if somewhere along the way, some malicious entity noticed the immense display of Wanda's insanely elevated powers, like a buzzard smelling a carcass or a shark smelling blood in the water. Or unfortunately just going to have to wait and see again for the answers to this one. Again, however, Wanda is kept from remembering too much. As she recalls how it all started, she turns back to see an undead Pietro complete with bullet holes and fresh blood and... Anyways, we see on Darcy/Hayward's monitors that Vision is nearing the border of the Hex. He attempts to walk through it, and I do say attempt because it really looks like someone trying to separate two poles of two very strong magnets. While initially successful for a few moments, the portions of his body, which are presumably a fabrication by Wanda's powers, begin to attract back to the Hex, slowly leaving behind only the dead parts of his body which she rescued from the sword facility. I was shocked by this, seeing as how earlier comments would have suggested that changes to matter inside the Hex is at the very least semi-permanent. Billy telepathically hears his father dying, and sensing something is wrong, goes to alert Wanda. Side note, Billy's own magical powers manifest at this point, and you can briefly see the blue hue of his magical energy that is characteristic of the character of Wiccan once he, grows up and grows into his powers. Him and Tommy go find Wanda, and they tell her that something's wrong. And in one last display of bizarre awareness, Pietro remarks that your undead husband can't die twice, before being knocked away by a now annoyed Wanda. In an attempt to save Vision, she swells and expands the boundaries of the Hex in a huge display of strength, simultaneously reabsorbing/saving Vision from death, again, swallowing Darcy, and warping the shield base into a circus. You can actually see at this scale as Hayward's car drives away that you can now see the faces of the hexagonal border. We've known for 2 episodes now that the Hex warps reality, but this is the first scene where we've really seen the full scope of that power. And we end on a shot of Wanda's red, powered-up eyes. What the Bjork is going on this roller coaster horror house of a show? I know I keep harping on this, but seriously, every time we get one answer, it raises 2 more questions. And more than anything, like I said before, I'm really shocked with how dark this show is turning out to be. I feel quite confident stating that this is the darkest property that Marvel has produced so far. What was tripping me up the most here was Pietro's very peculiar behavior. His sinister personality here was almost blatantly evil, to the point now where I have to think I may have been right with my dismissive first prediction from last week. That this isn't an alternate universe Pietro, but some sort of magical fabrication, sent in either to gather information from Wanda or simply to further mess with her mental instability. The questions he asks make him honestly seem like a henchman. And I think he's acting more sus here than Agnes, for Christ's sake. A henchman for whom, however, is the big question. Because while I can't deny Wanda having a heavy hand in this, I still firmly believe that something else or someone else is present here pulling strings. And I also just now have to take a note. I've commended Paul Bettany and Elizabeth Olsen on their acting chops here, but Evan Peters is just so wonderfully charming as the cool, suave uncle in this episode, and I really hope that he sticks around because I think he's just doing a great job. More than anything else, though, I just love how much they're really leaning into the vast scope of Wanda's true powers here. They're fully on display, and that's something that I and others have been waiting to see for a few movies now. And I hope that the stakes only get higher with that. But that's what I got, though, guys, for this week. If you have any theories of your own or observations that you think I didn't catch, please feel free to leave them in the comments and bring them to my attention. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you all next week for episode 7.